I always feel like I have a lot of things to say in these episodes. It's kind of weird, actually, when you think about it. Let's go ahead and start with a discussion about something incredibly boring. By which I mean incredibly fascinating to me and incredibly boring to everyone else on the planet. Holographic rights. Now, bear with me for a moment, because I've talked about this a little bit before with regards to the Doctor, but I feel like I've made my position pretty clear. I think that a hologram who has reached sufficient intellectual capacity and external stimuli can reach a point where they can be considered sentient and therefore have to be decreed sentient, beings, and all the rights, privileges, etc. that would normally be accounted to sentient beings, especially in a setting like Star Trek. So, and I have argued that the Doctor was not initially sentient, but time and experience made him so. One could actually levy that same argument at human beings. Do you say an infant is sentient? At what point do you say they have become sentient? It's a very gray issue, which is why I try to avoid specific definitions, because definitions are, by their nature, wrong in a situation like this. But that being said, that's not quite what I'm going into here. See, it's interesting to me, because of all the Star Trek shows, the only one to actually really look at holographic rights, really, is Voyager. TNG had a very brief stint with sentient holograms, some of which are debatable, some of which are not. The only one hologram that I think most people would agree definitively was sentient was, of course, Moriarty. Now, before you think I'm bashing on TNG for not covering this issue that they themselves brought up, because Moriarty was the first sentient hologram, let's also point out the fact that there was supposed to be more of that, in fact, quite a bit more. And I just feel like pointing out that the rights and intellectual privileges of an individual were not capable of being discussed on a show because of copyrights on intellectual properties of an individual. Anyways, the point I'm trying to reach here, though, is that TNG didn't really do anything with that per se, and neither did Deep Space Nine. Vic Fontaine showed up and was like, hey, I'm sentient. And everyone was like, okay, he's sentient. No discussion, no elaboration, no nothing. And of course, forgive me for elaborating, but they have something called a holosuite, which has programs specifically designed to cater to people, well, there's no nice way to say this, who want sex. Now, sexual slavery is arguably one of the worst things that exists, so I don't think that they're saying on Deep Space Nine that those holograms are actually people or sentient or otherwise have rights, because otherwise that would be really, really horrifying. And to further this point, the Doctor himself, over on Voyager, now that we've skipped forward to that series, has many times used holograms and destroyed holograms and deleted holograms without real regard towards them as sentient people. He considers certain holograms sentient and not others. And that's kind of the point I'm reaching. Both Deep Space Nine and TNG, and most especially Voyager, all make that clear distinction. Not all holograms are sentient. That's a very important distinction, because if all holograms were sentient, then that raises so many issues I don't even know where to start, so let's just not even touch that. But they're not, and it's really obvious why the writers made that distinction in all three shows as well. After all, that would raise a lot of issues. You want to talk about us perpetuating a slave race, Gaiden. Anyways, so, that being said, Voyager touches on a few interesting points of this. I'm going to be talking about this a bit as we go forward throughout Voyager. We've already talked about the discussions of the Doctor as an individual and an entity, and I think at this point we could pretty definitively say the Doctor is a person. But, here's an interesting one. This episode raises this point, and then actually doesn't really discuss it. And it does some things right, it does some things wrong. It's very strange the way it approaches this. And then it actually flushes the point out the window and actually claims the entire point invalid. I'll talk about that a little bit later. The idea of becoming Okay, this is another gray thing, so I'm going to try to avoid definitions here. So we're going to define this into sexual interest, infatuation, physical attraction, that kind of thing, and romantic interest, which we will define loosely as emotional and mental attraction, okay? Now, these two paths of attraction are some of the most varied and complex things that exist in human nature. I have heard arguments literally going to the furthest end of the extreme of we exist just for procreation, to the furthest extreme of procreation exists just for the people, to everything in between. I have heard it all. Trust me on this one. So, I can see my own reflection in my glasses. I should probably turn off the monitor here. There we go. So we've got this sort of thing. Now, if you become sexually attracted to a hologram or a holographic character, I'm just going to go and be blunt. That's totally understandable. There's nothing different or disparaging about that than finding a particular person in a cartoon or a movie or a video game or a book physically attractive, right? Whether or not you agree with that personally, you have to understand that that's a thing that some people do. And the idea of finding enjoyment in the fantasy emphasis, that'll be important in a moment, the fantasy of engaging in some kind of physical interactions with someone like that is understandable. So no judgment here, right? I'll be totally honest, that's not what I would want to do, but that's for my own personal reasons, which I'm not going to share here. I mean, holy crap. But my point is, even though I don't want that, even though I don't conjoin to that point of view, there's nothing wrong with having that point of view. There's no judgment here. There's no shame. It's just you find a fictional character attractive. Okay. Sure. I'm with that. Here's the tricky part. It's when we go over to this side, when you start getting intellectually and emotionally attached to someone who isn't real. Now, I am one of those people who hates the phrase, not real. And that's because most people use that term in an elitist, dickish way. I could give you two examples right off the top of my head. Example number one, oh, you don't listen to real music. Example number two, oh, you don't have a real job. So obviously, I use that phrase with a bit of trepidation, but the point I'm trying to reach is, based on what is presented within the setting, we can pretty clearly delineate that holograms who aren't sentient are literally just tools. Fictional, holographic subroutines. Tuvok himself says it in this episode. Not something that needs to be considered as if they're a person. And so I'm going to treat them as if they're not a person. And yet, one of the consistent things we've seen is that the holodeck has the capacity to make a sentient hologram, since it's done it at least 3 times. Moriarty was a mistake, remember. Now, we could argue, even though this is never shown on any of the shows, that after the Moriarty incident, they changed the way the holodeck works to make sure that never happens again. Possible, which could explain why we've never heard about it again. But then you have Vic Fontaine, who was deliberately made that way. So, Moriarty was an accident, Vic Fontaine was a mistake. The Doctor's kind of an in-between situation. He was deliberately incredibly advanced, sufficiently advanced to be able to more or less operate independently, regardless of attachment or enslavement to the ship's computers, and the capacity to, make decisions, triage, etc. He had to be. He was a doctor. He had to be stupidly advanced. So it was kind of intentional, but at the same time, he was never intended to be sentient. So what ended up happening is he's a combination of both. You see, he was very advanced, and then accidentally encountered more and more and more experience, which gave him more and more data, which allowed him to grow into a sentient being, just like a human being would as a child. And given this clear delineation, the problem is, let's say you find yourself emotionally and mentally attracted to a holographic character. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and say this, once again, no judgment. I personally would caution against such a thing for several reasons, not the least of which being the one I'm about to talk about. If you keep an advanced hologram on for a sufficient period of time, can you say with certainty it will not reach the point where it is sentient? Bonus question. Would you want to do that on purpose? To validate your emotional and mental attachment to this subroutine by elevating it above a subroutine into a person. Bonus question. When they reach that point of sentience, assuming they can, and what if they're not actually interested in you anymore? I don't want to speak too much about hard topics, but, domestic abuse is a problem, and shouldn't exist, if I can be just completely blunt about it. Imagine the potential for a situation in which you, in a moment of emotional peak, in which we are at our least controlled, without thinking, without foresight, delete that person. Computer, delete, hologram. 3 words, it's all it would take. Half a second, maybe, to spit that out in a peak of rage. You can't undo that. I think that anyone who is emotionally and mentally attached to a holographic character should approach that as if it was a bad thing. Simply and fundamentally, not a bad thing, I'm saying this wrong, as something that needs to be moved past from. Because no matter how you look at it, from a philosophical perspective, from a logistical perspective, from a fundamental biological perspective, it's not going to work. Not long term. There's simply too much of a can of worms you are opening up by trying to get into that. Here's the catch, though, and this is what this episode does beautifully. At no point does anyone look at Harry and say, "Oh, you're in love with a hologram. Oh, that's just cute." Or, "Oh, what's wrong with you, Harry? Couldn't find any living." No one tries to joke at him. No one tries to make fun of him. I love it. I love it because it's so exactly what it should be. Too often, Star Trek tries to take someone who is different or who is abnormal and just paste the word comedy over it. Forgive me for quoting Sci-Fi Debris, point and laugh at the freak. This is something Star Trek's done since all the way back in the original series as their attempts at comedy. As I'm presenting this, it's obviously I don't find it funny, especially for a show that's supposed to be about tolerance and understanding, as it is proclaimed to be. But this episode is the exact opposite. Tom, Tuvok, and B'Elanna all interact with Harry and all approach him with understanding, with sympathy, and with an approach to their tone and their word choice that indicates that they actually care about this guy, rather than just making a joke at him. I love that, because that's exactly what should be done in this situation. Tom's own words echo it. "Harry, we've all been in love with a holographic character. It's something you just have to move on from." So, while I have no judgment of Harry Kim, or indeed Janeway, this will happen later, for beginning to have romantic entanglements, well, okay. While I have no judgment, I still think it's a bad thing, but I want to explain that no judgment thing, because it's obvious why there's no judgment in the physical attraction thing, because I'm just going to be blunt. There's fundamentally nothing different between enjoying a physical interaction with a very well-designed interactive toy than a less designed toy that happens to be shaped like a hand. And I'm just going to say it like that. If that's too subtle, screw you. I'm not elaborating anymore. So there's nothing wrong with that. Sorry, at least in my opinion. But why is there nothing fundamentally wrong with the emotional attachment? For the same reason that there's nothing fundamentally wrong with us, real people, here in everyday life, becoming emotionally and mentally attached to fictional characters. Now, I don't even mean in a romantic sense. I personally can't list any fictional character I have romantic feelings for, but I know several people who have. Most of them grew out of that, moved on from it, because they were a fictional character. Which is the beautiful trap of the holodeck, by the way. Your fictional character is someone you could talk to on a daily basis. You don't have to move on from them. So, a little more self-discipline is required there. But the point is, and this is the distinction that I feel really matters, just because that character isn't real, I've said this before, just because that character is not real does not mean we and our feelings and the impact it has on us and our real lives does not matter. Forgive me for using the cliched example, but in Dragon Age Origins, I grew to genuinely care about those characters, especially the main party members. I grew to the point where I wanted them to have a happy ending. I wanted to work so hard to take care of these people and to make sure that their lives were bettered by my interaction with them. Now, granted, a video game's kind of a cheat, really, when it comes to this kind of a discussion, because a video game is defined by interactive medium. Therefore, my interaction with you is real. I'm actually interacting with these characters. The characters are not real. And when it's in a book or a movie or a show or anything else like that, there's an extra layer separating you. And yet it's still easy to become attached, isn't it? I'm going to use another example then. We'll skip from the Dragon Age one, actually. We'll go to the better one. Babylon 5. I cared about Londo Mollari. I watched that man's private moments and his destruction of personality and self to the point where he was just a bitter shell of a man and then barely managed to crawl himself back out of that to become Londo Mollari, the awesome. And I'm just going to say it like that. There's a reason he's my favorite character in that show. He did the full character arc throughout that thing. More like 2 character arcs, actually, if you want to get down to it. My interaction with that, my perception of that, my emotions on that, my feelings on that, my thoughts on that, my studies on that, my discussions on that are real. Therefore, my feelings on the matter are real and therefore matter. Now, Londo Mollari is a fictional character played by an actor. And that's important, because I understand and recognize and respect that difference. If, to use a fictional example, if I was really into Ivanova, you know, I was infatuated, because that's the word, it's not in love with. If I was infatuated with Ivanova, okay, that's understandable. She is a very strong-willed, intelligent, strong female protagonist. Excuse me. Okay, understandable, but she's not real. My feelings may be real, but she is not. So there's nothing wrong with indulging that in the short term, but in the long term I have to acknowledge the reality of the situation and say, okay, you know, there's nothing here. This is why the holodeck is such a dangerous device when it comes to a philosophical discussion. I have had entire days, plural, long discussions over the period of several sessions with people just on the nature of the holodeck and what it means from a moral perspective, from a societal perspective, from a technological perspective, from a literal perspective, from a fundamental moral, cultural impact perspective, you know? Because the holodeck it doesn't actually remove that veil. This is the thing about the holodeck. It does not remove the veil of, that's fake, but I'm real. It doesn't remove that, because that's still there. They're still fake. You're still real. Your feelings are still real about a fake character. Your feelings are still valid about a fake character. But that's still a fake character. But the holodeck lies to you about that. The holodeck is so realistic and designed to be so realistic. It is all of the worst aspects of VR in terms of potential for lack of a better word, corruption that exist. It is telling you, it is lying through its teeth to you constantly that, no, this is a person, no, this is a person, no, this is a person. No, they aren't. Maintaining that distinction is the important part. Now, I'm sorry, I'm going to cut this off here because I have much more to talk about this later when it applies to Janeway. But my point I want to summarize here in finality is that there's nothing wrong with Harry Kim becoming infatuated with a holographic character. There really isn't. And yet the episode itself cheats. Because the implication of the episode, if you analyze it, is very obvious. No holographic character who is not sentient is going to be sufficiently complex to engender an emotional response from you. The only reason Kim was infatuated with Mariana was because she was a real person. Done boring you, hopefully. For those of you who don't know, this episode was Robert Picardo's first directing position. I've talked about this before, I'm just going to cover this brief. Almost every actor on a show like Star Trek gets a position in the directing slot. It's part of the spread your... it's how people kind of keep getting jobs in Hollywood, in television. You don't just act in Hollywood. If you do, you either are a really good actor and are set in it, or you're in a rut dead end job, because you need to get experience directing, you need to get experience producing, you need to get experience writing in order to have enough of a resume so that when this show ends or when this movie ends, you can cycle your way into a number of different other jobs. It's very logical, and there's a reason that's built into so many clauses. At least it was back in the 90s and 2000s, early 2000s. So Robert Picardo got his first job this time. It was his rotation, and he spoke wonderfully about it. And personally, I think he did a really good job of it. It wasn't anything phenomenal. It's not as good as Livingston, who's just amazing, but he does some good damn stuff, and he really likes angles that really emphasize a character's emotions. I think that's how I'm going to phrase that. Pay attention to the episode sometime. Watch the angles. He'll do something where he's looking down at someone who is in it downward, or he'll look up at someone who is more optimistic. He does that a lot. It's interesting little subtle stuff. Nice touches. Speaking of production issues, for those of you who don't know, Garrett Wang, he's the gentleman who plays Harry Kim, actually had a head cold / flu issue. There's conflicting reports, but basically he was pretty sick, pretty ill, when this episode was being made. I feel really bad for him, because he obviously was struggling the whole time. Robert Picardo himself mentioned how he was having significant issues, basically getting him ready for any given scene, because he was just... It's funny, because if you watch the episode, not only is that really obvious, but in some cases you can see how he incorporated it into his performance. And I mention that because... Well, I don't want to talk about the acting issue yet again, but most people think Garrett Wang is a bad actor because he played Harry Kim. But they're wrong. Every time Harry Kim is given a chance to stretch a little, he's awesome. And I think this episode was one of the first times we really get to see that. Garrett Wang actually incorporating his literal physical illness into his performance of someone who is mentally and emotionally distraught. Yeah, well done. That being said, there is one scene where it's actually pretty obvious that he is struggling just to say his lines. If you want to rewatch the episode, it's the scene right before the luau when he's talking with Tom in Harry's quarters. Poor guy. Definitely dedicated. Now, this is another interesting thing about this episode. This was originally a Harry Kim episode. Now, you're probably looking at me weird. There's two reasons you could be looking at me weird. Number one, you could say, well, it is a Harry Kim episode. It's just a Harry and a Tuvok episode. Valid point. You could also be looking at me weird saying, I don't remember Harry Kim being in this episode. I actually heard a couple friends who said something pretty much exactly like that, who basically thought this was just a Tuvok episode, because the most memorable parts of the episode tend to be about when the ship was in danger, which is all about Tuvok, and Harry has basically left the picture at that point. This is another example of real life kind of editing the script. Basically, this was originally a fully Harry Kim episode. Now, if you've seen this episode, you'll probably see what I mean by this, but picture all the scenes between Mariana and Tuvok, and replace Tuvok with Kim. And actually, it makes surprising amount of sense if we propose that Harry Kim is the scientific, basically genius that he has been presented at several points in the past. If he is this guy who is awkward and kind of, shy and doesn't really know what he's doing, but at the same time he's really, really smart, really, really analytical, very scientifically minded, etc., etc., it makes sense that he would be the one who distances himself by, doesn't actually know how to blend in, approaches but nevertheless makes an example of himself. He's the one who has someone devoted back at home that he's still committed to. He understands what it's like to be alone. There's a lot of ways that it would actually make sense for Harry Kim to be the main character of this episode. That being said, I think the inclusion of Tuvok was an awesome one for two big reasons. Number one, Tim Russ, and number two, Tim Russ. I'll talk about that more in a bit, but I just felt like mentioning that. I do also like one other thing. Too often, Vulcans are portrayed as superior, snobbish, arrogant assholes. I'm just going to say it like that. And I don't like that, personally. I understand it in some cases. In fact, it's going to be ironic, because when I mentioned it in Deep Space Nine, I'm probably going to be mentioning how I like it there, too. But the point is, too often you get the thing. Enterprise was actually especially bad about this, about the superior Vulcan approach to everything. And I like the fact that, and I mentioned this in brief before with the three characters who interact with Harry, Tuvok listens to his plight, doesn't make fun, doesn't mock him, doesn't act superior, takes his request at face value and says, yes, I will help you. I like that. That is very Vulcan. It is, in my honest opinion, it is not a true Vulcan, and I've said this before, Tim Russ is basically the true Vulcan, will not act so blatantly arrogant or superior. They will simply acknowledge that this situation is, and that I have the power to help it, so I will help it. Very logical. Of course, there's reasons for the superiority thing, but moving along. I also love the complexity of Tuvok's performance in this episode. This is another example of a actor having a degree of control over the character. Tim Russ actually went to Joe Menosky, I want to say, is the one who wrote this episode, and said, you have to make Tuvok not infatuated with this woman. You have to remove the romantic entanglement. And Tim Russ insisted on this to the point of absolution. He was hardlining this. Because, in Tim Russ's opinion, Tuvok was simply too devoted to his wife and to his family, and the idea of him being the kind of person who would flirt or stray was something that was utterly alien to him. He could not bring himself to do that. So instead, he portrays Tuvok, and this is wonderful, he portrays Tuvok as someone who has a friendship and care and intellectual fascination with a member of the opposite gender with absolutely no romantic connection whatsoever. And I mention that because all too often, both in real life and in fiction, people look at a male and a female and say, oh, well, they have to be together if they're that close. I mean, how do you be friends with someone of the opposite gender without having romantic entanglements? And then I smack them across the face because they're stupid. But I like his subtle portrayal of it in this episode. Very well done. The script was actually edited to mention that. I love the tiny little scene. It's funny. This is like, I like this, I like this, I like this. I have so few negatives about this episode. It's a great episode. The tiny little scene that happens, it was actually padding, believe it or not. But this is how you do padding. Take note! Take note, writers and producers and directors of television everywhere. This is how you do padding, okay? Here's the thing, let me explain for a minute. I've talked before that padding is basically a bad thing, when you're just padding out an episode with meaningless drivel or technobabble or garbage or whatever, right? However, something that happens a lot in television is you just don't have enough script to fill an episode, or you actually run short on runtime, and so then you have to go back to the sets and record a few extra scenes. This is very common. When the editing is done, you have 41 minutes of footage and you need 44 and 30 seconds. Very common. What you do with that is you use it. You make something of it, and that's what this episode does. It's a tiny little thing. It's an episode between Tom and B'Elanna right before Tom goes to Harry's quarters. It's a scene that exists solely to emphasize the fact that Tom and B'Elanna are very, very gradually drifting towards each other. That they are becoming more tolerant and accepting of each other. That they're growing to like each other. Not even necessarily romantically. Just as friends. It's that slow boil I've talked about before. It'll keep going. It'll be quite a while before those two end up together. And again, it's awesome because they bothered to take their time and do it, and they used moments like this to slowly flesh that out. It would be entirely too cheap if one episode Tom was like, B'Elanna, and B'Elanna's like, Tom, and then they're together. Bam, one episode, 60 minutes, or 40 minutes rather. No. But anyways, I'll talk about that more later. Excellent scene. I also just want to give props to the scene between Harry and Tom. I've kind of already discussed the reasons why. Garrett Wang's performance is amazing, especially given how the fact that he was practically dying of his head cold there, or flu or whatever it was. And Tom's approach to him was genuinely that of a real friend, you know. Tom was there to help. And when Harry made it clear that Tom was not wanted, Tom went to leave, and then Harry realized that Tom was just there because he cared about them, and Harry's like, okay, wait. All right, I'll acquiesce. I liked that. It was good, and it was awesome, and it really shows the friendship between those two. There's one other thing I like there, and this is so Vulcan. I love it. Calto, the game they keep playing, they introduced. I'm paraphrasing this in a way that, in my opinion, is more literally direct. Calto is not about imposing order. It is about finding order. It is about finding the harmony in what already exists, the natural chaos. And that, in my opinion, is the best way to describe the entirety of the Vulcan mindset in one sentence. And that brings me to my next point. Pretty sure it's my next point. Yep. Vulcans, and this is true, some writers tend to forget this, Vulcans actually have very strong emotions. Their emotions are so powerful, they actually can cause literal damage to a Vulcan's brain or body if allowed to run unchecked. They can lead to something like, oh, I don't know, the Romulans, if allowed to run unchecked. And I'll discuss that much later when we get to TNG, which really is our one episode that really, or one series that goes into the Romulans. But my point here is that this episode very clearly presents the fact that Tuvok has emotions. and that he pretends to have control over those emotions, and yet the truth is all he does is maintains he finds order amongst his own emotional turmoil rather than imposing it. And it's never spoken. Never once in the episode does it say that. He mentions that line about Kalto. She mentions later on about how he doesn't have control over his emotions. And between the overall dialogue between him and Mariana, we get that impression. We get that clear picture that what he is doing is the true Vulcan way. And it might even be why Tuvok is the Vulcan. Because he's not trying to impose his own order upon his own internal, emotional, turmoil, chaotic self. He is simply finding the order that naturally exists in that chaos. Beautiful, beautiful presentation. I also really like the fact that they also were using this episode to establish Vorik's romantic interest in B'Elanna. It's pretty stupid, but I do. Okay, I gotta explain that a little bit. See, Vorik is a Vulcan. You probably already see the problem if you're watching this show, because you're already a Star Trek fan if you're watching this, most likely. But if you're not, just on the offhand, Vulcans have a thing called the Pon farr. The Pon farr is a period of time that they have found that there's been a lot of theory and debating about this. Most believe that this is kind of a cultural and societal inevitability, an evolution that happened over a long period of time of suppressing emotions and self-control, etc. That is a natural byproduct of a species' need to reproduce, while at the same time a species that approaches reproducing as if it's a mere basic necessity. It's complicated, but I don't want to get too much into that. The point being, Vulcans have the Pon farr. That means every so often... Go ahead, tell me the years. I know you're wanting to. Every so often, they have to do one of several things, one of which includes mating, or they will basically self-destruct. Again, emotions running rampant, etc. I mentioned that earlier. Now, here's why it's stupid. There are a minimum of 2 Vulcans on Voyager, and I say a minimum because we know 2 of them, Vorik and Tuvok. However, there are also Vulcans mentioned in a later episode. Counterpoint is the name of the episode, in addition to these 2. So... What? I'm sorry, let me get to my point here. I understand that the Pon farr is a deeply personal thing that the Vulcans do not like discussing with outsiders. Spock, a half-human, made that incredibly clear all the way back in Amok Time. And yet, when you're in the Vulcans are also logical and strict enough to realize that, oh, hey, we're stuck in the Delta Quadrant. We need to deal with this because we could be here for longer than 7 years. So the mere fact that the issue of the Pon farr just snuck up on them is stupid. And I'm just going to say it that way. We'll talk about that more when we get there. I don't want to go too much into that right now. But, I do like the fact that they were sowing the seeds of the fact that Vorik had already chosen his mate in advance, which is hilarious because it shows that the writers, knowing that the Pon farr thing was going to come, were like, okay, let's start sowing the seeds of him being interested in B'Elanna, so that it'll make more sense then. And then in the episode, they just fling that out the window, because, common sense is for tourists, apparently. I like the portrayal of Mariana as a character. Forgive me for saying this, but she strikes me as a very character similar to myself in her analytic nature. She tends to look at someone and... I've often said that just because you're hiding something doesn't mean it's hidden. Or in other words, the way in which you are hiding something from me is almost more indicative than what you're hiding. The way you use your body language, the way you use your word choice, the way you motion with your hands or your eyes, your tonality, the pace with which you speak, all of these things speak volumes to what you are communicating and what you are trying not to communicate. I've been doing this for so many years, ever since I was in school, to be totally honest, that to me it's like everyone's wearing blinding flashers saying, this, it's so obvious. And some of my friends get upset at me when I say that, because, it's like, oh, of course, you're this. And they just look like, what? And it's like, yeah, it's really obvious. And they're like, but that being said, it's fascinating to see a character presented in that same style. Because... it's surprising how rare that is in fiction, to see someone who is analytical on a personal level like that. Now, of course, Sherlock Holmes then came out, the recent TV series with Benedict Cumberbatch, and then took that to the nth level, which is way more than anything I could ever do. But it's another reason why I find that archetype fascinating. Because the entire point of that kind of character is, this is a character who pays attention. For one reason or another, in her case, it was because of her severe isolation and near desperate need to interact with others. And yes, I'm kind of analyzing the analyzer. I get the humor here. But the point is, the episode lays this bare, though. It is, again, very obvious. She was someone who, through her own efforts and introversion and desire to not actually physically interact with anyone else, found herself in a situation where the more she retreated, the more she wanted to interact with others. And that kind of a character would naturally be someone who pays a great deal of attention and notices the details, etc. But that leads me nicely into my next point. I actually only have 2 points here, and then we're done. First of all, I like the symmetry of this episode. Now, I actually, you're probably looking at me weird. Pay attention to Harry's emotional responses at the beginning of the episode. Pay attention to Mariana's emotional responses at the end of the episode, and then put 2 and 2 together. Now, Mariana's is arguably more severe, but at the same time, they kind of aren't. Only her actions are more severe. Her emotions are identical to Harry's. Everything that Harry went through with his trauma, with his embarrassment, with his discouragement. Tuvok actually mentions several things about his emotional responses early on and actually lays them bare. And props to Garrett Wang for actually acting like that, so we aren't being told something rather than being shown. We are given both. But his emotional responses are so obvious at the beginning of the episode. The thing is, Harry Kim is a Starfleet officer who has discipline, who has duty, who has his own particular sense of self-restraint, which is, again, why the Vulcan self-restraint episode could have probably worked if it was just Harry Kim, in my opinion. And then we have a woman who has no interest or indeed purpose behind having such a restraint because she has not had to actually interact with other people in years. Now, if that doesn't actually have significance to you, try to think about not interacting with another human being for years. I know people, and this is not intended as a joke, I know people who lose social skills over the course of months of isolation because they, to use the old term, buried themselves in the code. And they forgot how to interact with other people because they weren't doing it on a regular basis. It's very common, actually, in human psychology to be adaptive. I've said this 1 trillion times. Human beings are adaptive. It is our greatest strength and our greatest weakness, because we will adapt in ways we shouldn't, depending on cultural and societal economical norms, etc., blah, blah, blah. Point being, imagine a person who has adapted to not interacting with other people, to not discussing, to not conversing, to not anything. Someone who has those same strong emotions Harry Kim has, but has nothing to temper them. All she has is her emotions, and nothing else. She couldn't even turn her own analytical eye onto herself until Tuvok did it right at the end of the episode. And in honesty, I think the only reason that worked was because Tuvok was demonstrating that wonderful Vulcan trait, morality. Too often people think of Vulcans like the Borg. But let me distinguish the Borg from the Vulcans right here and right now. The Borg are logical. The Vulcans are logic tempered with morality. Tuvok obviously cared about this woman. Not romantically, but affectionately, as a kindred intellect, as someone who was an intellectual, individual person, someone who was, to go back to that point at the beginning, sentient, and therefore mattered. And his obvious caring of her, and his allowance of presenting it to her, I think is what finally got through to her, and made her realize how far she had gone in her own instability. That brings me to my final point. It is so easy to sympathize with Mariana in this episode. That probably sounds funny, because she's obviously the, shall we say, villain of the episode. The threat of the week. But in addition to everything I just mentioned, there's a concept that I like to call you don't know it until you don't have it. Now, you might be thinking, oh, well, you mean you don't know what you have until you've lost it. That is similar, but this is in a negative aspect. I feel it needs to be distinguished, because there's a difference between I've become accustomed to my friend being here, and then my friend leaves, and now I miss them terribly. I didn't realize what I had until it's gone. And that's a positive, versus I'm in pain every day of my life, but I've become accustomed to it. Until one day something happens, whether I go under medicine, or I get my back fixed, or a giant kidney stone is removed from me. And all of a sudden that pain goes away. And I realized just how much pain I was in, and I had never fully processed how much I was being negatively impacted, because I didn't know it till it was gone. Tuvok represented the removal of that for her. She was in such a sorry state, lonely, sad, quiet, until there was literally a break in the clouds. Tuvok. But unlike the kidney stone example I just gave, Tuvok was going to leave. That would mean the clouds would come in again. And that's why her actions are so understandable to me. Because if you told me that all that pain was going to come back now that I'm aware of it, that's terrifying. That's horrifying, and I would be desperate to try and stop that. Just like she was. I find myself wondering what happened to her, and I actually hope that we'll find out in STO now that we finally got to the Delta Quadrant. Regardless, I leave you with these thoughts. Holograms are awesome, yo. No, I'm kidding. I'll see you guys next time.
I beg your pardon.
I think you're trying to isolate yourself and make a public protest at the same time.
Explain.
You didn't want to be here in the first place. Being the only one without a lay sets you apart from the others, allowing you to symbolically maintain your solitude. And since everybody can see that you're the only one without a lay, you're letting them know that you'd rather be somewhere else.
Or logic. Use impeccable